that ability for a bartender to not to feel like they have to do something to make a good drink is incredibly difficult, and like very understandably so, because bartenders, they're not like chefs. We've never really been given that space to just plate up good produce.
Hey everybody, thanks for tuning in to the latest episode of the You Can't Eat Money podcast. This time we're talking with Alex Francis, Director of Bars at Little Red Door in Paris. Alex was recently named to Drinks International's Bar World 100, and he helped shape Little Red Door's transition to a farm-to-glass model, which has helped cement the bar's reputation as one of the most sustainable in the world. A huge thanks to Alex for agreeing to chat. As I share in the episode, I didn't know what to expect when I first went to Little Red Door. My sister-in-law, who made amazing cocktails in some of the best spots in New York and Los Angeles, highly recommended it. So when I walked in and saw these amazing photos of farmers on the wall, I knew I was in for something really special. If you enjoy this episode with Alex, please make sure to follow him and Little Red Door, along with Little Red Door Projects on Instagram, and please leave a review on your favorite podcast platform for the You Can't Eat Money podcast. We also just launched a new page on bookshop.org that has a reading list of some of the books that inform this podcast, as well as the books of past podcast guests. If you buy something, we get a little commission, which will likely be used to buy more food and ecology books, so you'll be paid back with more and better recommendations. So without further delay, here's the latest episode of the You Can't Eat Money podcast with Alex Francis of Little Red Door in Paris. Today on the You Can't Eat Money podcast, we have Alex Francis, Director of Bars at Little Red Door Paris. Thanks for joining us today, Alex.
Thanks so much for having me.
So let's start at the start. For those that are unfamiliar, what is Little Red Door?
Little Red Door is a farm-to-glass cocktail bar here in Paris in Le Marais. We've been open for 10 years now. We started working in a farm to glass model probably 3.5 years ago now, just during the pandemic, really.
And so when you say farm to glass, what do you mean by that? What is that idea?
So farm to glass is essentially the same idea as farm to table, but working with liquids, specifically in our case cocktails, but generally wines and beers as well. We source our produce directly from producers. And for us, the intention is probably a little bit more literal than for most places, where that will often be a little bit more behind the scenes. So for us, we try and center our guest experience on the producers behind all of the liquids that our guests are consuming, with the intention of being able to tell them where every single drop of liquid in the glass comes from. But for us, it's about re-establishing that link that everything that you eat and drink, including alcohols, at some point it was grown in the ground, and how and why and where you do that is a choice. And so we look to support producers who do that job in a meaningful way for us. So whether that's protecting or preserving AOP and AOC growing regions, or whether that's working with people who are using regenerative farming techniques like permaculture, or whether it's supporting innovative projects like urban farms here in Paris. We try not to limit meaning or the value of those projects, but look to support as many people trying to do meaningful things in the world of agriculture.
That sounds really cool. So when you say AOP/AOC, what exactly do you mean by that?
So in France, you have 3 levels of protected growing regions. So it's normally foodstuffs that are protected. So the most well-known ones will be wines. So a lot of the time you'll see on your bottles of wines AOP or AOC, which will be protected regions. You also have IGP, which is the kind of the least protected region, or regional system, I guess. But we have many different ones around France, and it was a concept that was, I think, existed across a lot of Europe at the end of World War II already, in terms of, that there were certain regions and certain produce that was in and of itself valuable and unique due to its location, terroir, growing practices, or just the culture it was attached to. But the French very quickly realized that there was with the increase in monoculture farming and mass productivity that came after World War II, that a lot of those heritage and traditional products were at risk, specifically from the Americas, or at risk in being imitated. And so they went about creating a very strong system to protect a lot of those products. Whereas I think before World War I and World War II, those things were just taken for granted. You assumed that you couldn't really imitate them because you wouldn't be able to build those industries very quickly. And obviously after World War II, a lot of that changed.
Going back to Little Red Door, I think I first visited in December 2021, probably when you were in the midst or starting to make this transition to this farm to glass model. And I knew nothing about farm to glass. I just knew that Little Red Door was had been on the list, I think, for probably about 8 or 9 years at that point, of the world's best 50 bars. And my sister-in-law, who's a bartender in New York and LA, recommended I go check this out. So I go through the Little Red Door. This actually is a Little Red Door. And then I go inside and I see these amazing portraits of farmers, sort of some in the field next to their products. And then I got this amazing book, which sort of explains how those portraits connect to the ingredients. So what was the thinking first behind shifting to this farm to glass model, but two, putting such a heavy emphasis on individual producers and kind of centering each cocktail on the menu around one of these amazing ingredients from a different part of France?
Before we worked farm to glass, we did conceptual menus. We've done them for 10 years. We've had massive success with them. The original head bartender of Little Red Door had made quite a name in pushing what people expected of a cocktail bar. So the company's tagline is playfully pushing boundaries. So we always try to keep this balance of, we wanted to take what we did very seriously, but not take ourselves too seriously. And we developed this style of menu, which became increasingly the style of the menu that you came to see, which is a hardback book, which only focused on those 10 to 11 cocktails that we would do every year. When we came to putting together the first farm to glass menu, Grounded, we were really aware or really conscious of, we were looking to create something that genuinely did that. I think one of the things that we found frustrating with the conceptual menus was that they were always incredibly rewarding for us as a team, but they always required a lot of explanation. They always required a lot of elaboration. And when it came to putting the way we describe it, as we're putting the hidden heroes of our industry in the center, we wanted to do this in a really authentic, meaningful, and also very literal way. And so the book itself, we've learned through the conceptual menus that people, when they go to a cocktail bar, of course, a lot of people are there for a very unique experience. Some people, they don't really know what they're going for. They'll read a 50 best bar or whatever, and they'll just go in a way that I don't think they would do with, let's say, a restaurant, where you don't turn up to a restaurant and have no idea what the style of cuisine is. With a cocktail bar, many people will, because they go in with this idea that cocktail bars are quite utility almost, that they should be able to do a little bit of everything. We found that the hardback menu was a very good way of signaling from the very beginning to a guest that we take what we do quite seriously, and so it's what we feel like it's worth engaging with. So a lot more people will engage with the subject in that way. And then for the portraits, the idea was there's something very difficult to do with any kind of book in a meaningful way. You're always limited by the fact that someone's in a bar. They don't want to do too much reading. You don't want to dominate. It doesn't want to become too much of a magazine. you want to be able to give them as much information as they can handle in a way that still is very accessible and interesting. And so for us, the portraits were a really nice way of, that stereotype or that cliche story of like a picture is a thousand words. Those portraits told you so much more about the producers, where in France they are, how they work, when we say this is in, the Drôme Hills, for most people who come to the bar, they have no idea what the Drôme Hills look like. So to be able to show them that was a lot more rewarding. And also, by an extension of the menu, when you see you're surrounded by the portraits of the producers, when you have this hardback book in front of you about the producers, all of a sudden, it really does stop feeling like a marketing message of, oh, we put those producers at the center. It's very literal. There's nothing but producers in front of you and around you. So that's the main thing you have to engage with.
So I think people are probably familiar with this idea through Rene Redzepi and Noma of food that is connected to a time and place. And to that point you made about cocktail bars being utility, you have your favorite drink order. You might love a penicillin or an old fashioned or just a regular martini, and you go and kind of expect to get like a slightly different iteration or just a really good version of that cocktail, no matter where you are in the world. And I think, at least in my mind, when I started to learn about Noma's approach to food, it got kind of weird that I could go to a bar in Hong Kong, a bar in Tokyo, and a bar in LA, and they all had basically the same ingredients on the bar. The same type of whiskeys, the same type of gins. So when you think about creating a bar that is farm to glass and is more of a place, you're working with these amazing producers from around France. What is that shift like to actually execute a bar that is more in the style of a restaurant like Noma, that is of a time and place and really represents the best of what French products can bring to the world of cocktails?
When we first started working like that, we spent a lot of time trying to reconcile those two ideas, those two notions. And we still have team members today who have come through more traditional, more classic North American style cocktail bars where, they need to know 1,000 classic cocktails and they need to have their vermouth blend and their bitter blend and all those kind of things. And like you were saying, then also that you should have passion fruit available on every bar and blah, blah, blah. And then we still have members of the team who still feel like that's really important because that's what people have an expectation of in a bar, or that's the role that bar has in society. But for us, the way we work now, and the thing that we've learned more and more, is that we're less apologetic for the things that we aren't. We focus on what we do. So, for example, we try to celebrate that seasonality. So we actually, as we grew into the farm to glass model, we found two things. One was the scale of doing it in a bar like Little Red Door. We're very busy. We do any given night, we do about 400 to 500 cocktails, and we're only 45 seat venue. So the turnover in the room is massive. And obviously that's a lot of drinks to make everything from. So if the way we work, we make about 70 to 80% of the liquid that we sell, we essentially make ourselves from the produce. If we're making that many drinks, there's a spike or a growing trend of increasing sales. We can't just keep placing orders, and we can't do that outside of seasonality. And that idea of, being able to produce that much, we realized very quickly that we weren't able to offer everything that we wanted to. So we actually ended up moving to a model of having a set, almost like how we imagine it, more like the a la carte menu. And then we have a seasonal tasting menu now. And that helped remove a lot of demand on that main menu and allowed us to offer something a little bit more time related, because one of the big differences between how we work and how a restaurant works is restaurants have the ability to sprinkle in those fresh plates alongside some preserved or cured or whatever products that are a blend of different times or of different time scales. And in bars, we have to ferment or distill or macerate And so a lot of our stuff was becoming increasingly preserved, which is great. It gives us the ability to work in a scale and a longevity that restaurants struggle to. And so for us, we've created these different outlets to allow us to be the best version of what we think is our strength. So we never apologize for the things we don't have. We always highlight the things that we do. We also have become more and more confident in recommending places near buyers or if someone's looking for that very traditional experience. The best example is if we have North American guests who'll often come in and they will order a margarita with their favorite tequila brand. And we explain to them that our margarita, we don't use tequila. We do have agave spirits in the bar, but they're all sourced directly from Penenca's, which is carbon offset. So it comes in bulk. It can't be called tequila or mezcal. We actually don't. We only use a small amount of this in the drink because it's incredibly expensive for one, and also two, it's artisanal mezcal. It's not designed for making margaritas. It's way too intense and full bodied. So we blend that with a beetroot skin distillate. So that's a byproduct that we get from making another product, which is beetroot mistel, which is like a fortified wine. We have all the skins left over, and we realize that beetroot skin essentially has all of that earthy, rich, ever so slightly fruity flavors that you get from beetroot. So we make a distillate of that, and we actually use that as the base of our margarita. We explain that to guests that, this is how we do our version of a drink that looks and feels like a margarita. We also say if it's very visible that the person, that's not what they're into and they're just looking for their tastia, we recommend there's a bar around the corner called Candelaria. It's a really well regarded mezcaleria in the back of a taco shop, and we say if that's what you're looking for, they have that, and you're going to have an amazing night there. If that's the key point to your night is to have this thing, then we recommend that you go there. But if you want to try something new, if you want to try something different, you're here now, and this is what we do. And what we found was that really quickly changed that narrative away from we can't do something to they're trying something new. We try as much to focus our conversations through that. But like I said, we've got a lot better now at just accepting that we find the value in working with a sense of time and place, like you mentioned, from a lot of those really amazing restaurants that try to establish, you're coming here for something different. We've tried to establish that. And I think that when there aren't that many cocktail bars in the world who are able to do that, it's going to take a while for people's expectations to change a little bit. But at the same time, again, like even just like semantically, if someone books in to do our tasting menu, when you go to do a cocktail tasting menu, you're already starting to think, okay, maybe I'm not just going to have a Manhattan and a mojito here. So that's starting to help us as well. But that doesn't stop, a handful of guests every single night, just somehow inexplicably waiting 1 hour to get in and then getting in and just wanting to order their Manhattan with Rittenhouse and being like, we don't have that. But
totally. And I think what's interesting is we just talked to Douglas McMaster for the podcast, created Silo, the world's first zero waste restaurant. He has this thing called the invasive species dinner. He is trying to open people's mind, not just to seasonal eating, but different types of ingredients. And, this invasive species dinner includes gray squirrel, which is invasive to England and has knocked out the native red squirrel population. But he really talked about how part of that is really to open people's minds to a new way of eating and a new way of thinking about the food they eat. You just mentioned some of the challenges that you've had. Has there been any sort of highlights or really amazing experiences you've had with guests who all of a sudden started to get the concept and then really engaged with it and kind of took it beyond what you expected?
Yeah, I think for me, the most rewarding part was when it comes to guests is that you have those moments when they come in and with expectation. And I've heard multiple times now from people who come in and actually one of the really nice things is people say that they tell us they really wanted to enjoy the drinks. Like when I say really wanted, as in before they even got to Little Red Door, they'd read the concept and the style, and it felt like something that they wanted to enjoy. They felt like this is something that identifies with my values, that matches with me. I want this to be something I enjoy. And they get there and they say, oh, I was so happy that I did enjoy it. And it wasn't just a fad where they've got there and we write walnut on the menu and we chuck in loads of sugar syrup and walnut flavoring and it feels really empty. It's that authenticity of when you have those high quality produce, the flavor of a purple carrot or a variety of carrots, it has more depth and more flavor to it than just your regular off the shelf monoculture grown carrot. And that diversity of flavor isn't simple, so it means that you don't have that like very artificial heightened flavor profile of what you generically think of carrot, but it actually has more depth and it has more similarities to other root vegetables and it has more similarities to other earthy vegetables as well. And when people start to feel like, oh, this is kind of a bit like this and a bit like this, and you go, yeah, these are all naturally occurring in strong and healthy and diverse plants, what you start to see is people understand that things like organic and regenerative farming and these practices, they're not just buzzwords for, oh, this is healthier food. Like, this is more, it's more meaningful food in both a literal flavor sense and also for the world. And it's those moments that you start to make all of those connections with all those pieces of information that most people who are kind of quite well-meaning, and especially we have a lot of guests who come to our door, that consumers are highly educated nowadays, but they're just not necessarily, they don't necessarily connect all of those dots between the different choices and the different trends that are moving through consumerism. And one of the things that we were just in Peru with the guys at Matter, which is the research and multidisciplinary company behind Central, which was just voted #1 restaurant in the world, Puye, which was voted number 28, which are both in one venue in Lima. And then they also have a restaurant called Mill up in the Andes. They have a research center there. And speaking with the scientists they have up there doing every single day research, one of the things that they spoke about is, none of them had ever thought about working for a restaurant. And they spoke about the fact that when they arrived, all of them had come from, like academic backgrounds. So they were a little bit like sketchy of, well, why am I going to go work with this restaurant? Why am I going to work in this environment? And then they realized really quickly that food and drink is such an effective model or vehicle to engage with people about these subjects, whether it's preserving local communities, whether it's preserving heritage crops, whether it's just discussing political issues that affect specifically these Andean regions. They realized that both in terms of a funding point of view, a successful restaurant business is incredibly effective at valorizing these ideas, but also, in terms of engaging with the final consumer, you can put together all of these different threads and put them onto a plate or into a glass. And it's an incredibly effective way of actually getting someone's attention as to what matters and why. And I think that's also one of the things that people like Doug have done so well with Silo is especially when he had his venue down in Brighton, it wasn't all of the bells and whistles they have now in London. But one of the reasons why I think people resonate with it so much is that it was very literal, very unapologetic in presenting these different ideas of things that they felt were relevant to British people that there was no one really speaking about in the food industry, because everything was hidden behind tablecloths and this need to be fine dining. And Silo came along and said, no, all of these chefs, they were aware of a lot of these conversations. No one was having them with the guests.
How do you build a cocktail that works at Little Red Door, which operates very differently than a lot of other cocktail bars?
Well, there are two sides to it. So there's the main menu, the a la carte menu. That one is more, it's that classic combination of inspiration and balance. So you make a wish list of every year with the team of things we would love to work with, and these are more like those halo products. So these are the things that we're going to have to go out of our way, source them. Sometimes they're already there. Sometimes as we're starting to think about a new menu, one of the producers will reach out to us and say, look, I've got a really good crop of this year, or I've got an excess of this year. And so we start to already have those in mind. And sometimes we're looking to add something into the menu, which we didn't have before. For example, the last menu just gone, we worked with a aromatics farm out in Brittany. And one of our team members said that they wanted to do something with one of their aromatics, but they wanted to find something, a distinct flavor, because obviously within the world of aromatics, people become very aware of many, many different flavor profiles. And so one of our team members went and specifically with them looked for something that they could grow that we could then work with. That's for the main menu. That's when we then start to piece it together and say, actually, we're missing maybe a more earthy cereal flavor. We're missing this. And then all of a sudden the whole menu starts to piece together like that. And then it's also that balance of what's achievable logistically, because if you pick 10 products, which are all summer vegetables, it would be incredibly hard to process all of those, because when we're processing ingredients for a Little Red Door main menu drink, you're looking at about 15,000 serves a year. That's something like a fortified wine. You're getting well over 300, 400 liters of a product in kit sometimes. And so that's a lot of work. So we also have to then balance, well, we can't do everything all at once. So then let's look for things that fit naturally together in a calendar. When it comes to the seasonal tasting menu, because that menu is intentionally designed to work on a much smaller scale. So because we found that after the first menu, our producers were starting to feel like they weren't able to provide consistently enough produce for our needs when everything was going through that one menu. We created the seasonal menu, and one of the big ideas between the seasonal menu was allow us to take smaller crops in, or smaller deliveries of crops, produce smaller batches of ingredients, and have these exist for a much shorter period of time. So these could last for a week, 2 weeks, or even a whole season, depending on how much we get. And this also allows us for a little bit more variety in the serves. Within those, a tasting menu compared to an a la carte menu, the volume of liquid you're using, the intricacies of the serve are very different. In the main menu, we work on creating things that we can do at speed and scale. So even though Little Red Door isn't necessarily considered a high volume cocktail bar, the amount of drinks that we go through is very high relative to other people in our space. Whereas with the seasonal menu, it's very controlled because it's all pre-sold and it goes out in seatings. And so we can be a little bit more intricate and a little bit more out there with the serves. And when we go to put together what we want to use for the seasonal menu, we always try and leave space for those, last minute phone calls where someone says, oh, by the way, I'm going to drop off your tomatoes and we've got these, would you be interested in them? And we also start to try and build kind of benchmarks around the year of things that we definitely want to see that we were never really able to do before. So this October is a really good example. We have set aside 1 week where we'll be getting in one of the first mandarin crops from our citrus producer in the Pyrenees. And we'll take those in. We'll do 1 week where we have a drink that looks and feels not too dissimilar to something like a Garibaldi. And it will be the first time in a very long time Little Red Door has used the fresh citrus drink. Then 3 months later, after having infused all of the citrus skins that were left over from that week to make essentially a triple sec, we'll have a drink on the menu based on more like a sidecar from that. And so by that, bit by bit, as you start to piece together this idea of, oh, well, we would love to use fresh orange juice, so let's put that in October and we'll have this here. And then that means we'll have this leftover citrus peel that we can make into a liqueur. Let's put this in March where we can do this. All of a sudden, when you start to do that with every season and every produce you can think of that you're excited to work with, all of a sudden you run out of space and time to do everything you want to. And so the really nice thing is that for both the main menu and the seasonal menu, where a lot of that creative process used to be very intentional, what we found is we haven't really asked ourselves now in 3-4 years, how do we innovate and stay creative, because so much of what we do now is driven by what the producers want to do and the connections we make. And so for us, it's also a much healthier, more sustainable creative model as well, which is not something we speak very openly about with the farm to glass model. We were so naive going into it. We had no idea what we were getting ourselves in for, the amount of work, the diversity of tasks we were going to have to learn to conquer. But every single time we've gone along, every step we take with well, this is hard, but it feels like a natural, healthy step forward in a different direction from how we used to work.
Does that challenge of doing so much direct trade and working direct with the farmers on this amazing produce that you can use in a variety of different ways. Does that mean you have to recruit a different type of mixologist, bartender, person who, I can't imagine someone from just a regular bar coming into Little Red Door and like immediately understanding how to operate? Is that a challenge that you face?
Yeah, there's two challenges. The one is, we've intentionally, since COVID, we hired people with relatively low experience. We've accommodated now, and just more recently, a couple more experienced staff members. But specifically after COVID, we intentionally hired people who were purely chosen on attitude, basically people who understood what we wanted to do and why, wanted to engage with them, and also didn't come with a lot of those preconceptions. And we felt that was really important in the team to be able to make sure that we stayed on track and stayed motivated and committed. From the skill set point of view, it was very difficult in that you're asking bartenders to do things that they're never going to have the experience of doing, organizing the logistics of getting a lot of this produce delivered, understanding the timeframes of how to process these ingredients and all that. But what we found was that once we had the right people in them, it's kind of like a startup attitude. You figure out everything as it comes. We never really stopped to say, well, can we do this? We just said, well, what's the best thing to do? And then it doesn't matter if we don't know how to do it or not, we'll just figure it out. And so what it meant was that naturally within our team as well, we got more and more people who have more kind of universal skill sets. For example, we have two team members, Clerman and Alexia, who work in back of house. They are very, very organized people. They're very, very consistent people. They like a stable working environment. They like consistency, and they like to be able to plan, which they really came into their own in back of house. But because the two of them are definitely not your conventional bartenders. Both of them over their time with us have had issues where they've struggled with confidence in front of house, and have no doubt whatsoever that given the time and the opportunity to spend more time in front of house, both of them would have overcome those things and will still be able to do many things that are guest facing. But what we found is that we were able to actually create a pathway to keep them in the team for longer, which involved them working in back of house more steadily. The team overall got so much more from them. And it's something that we've seen more and more in the way we work, is as we've become more and more specialized in some of our roles, we've created these pathways for team members to stay in the team for longer. We're not naive enough to think that, we've created a model where everyone can stay forever and we'll just keep growing, because there will come a limit when we can't really expand the team anymore and we can't do more. But since COVID, we've grown from 5 to 25 people. And that growth has kept pretty much everybody within the team. And so we're reaping the benefits from having that really stable, experienced team who have learned together. We've made mistakes together. The other side of it, though, in terms of like working in this way, is the creative side of it. And that's something that a lot of the team, when they join, they struggle with. We're very specific in the way we make our drinks, which is how can we do the least amount of intervention to get the best version of that produce onto a glass. And for a lot of bartenders, that can feel almost like simplistic. For example, if we make a fortified wine from strawberries, if the best version of that drink is just to have that chilled, that will be the drink in Little Red Door. We will not do anything else. A walnut, for example, our drink on tap, is a fortified wine made from a Marc de Bourgogne, green walnuts, and red wine. It's the three put together, infusing, and then put on tap. That ability for a bartender to not to feel like they have to do something to make a good drink is incredibly difficult, and very understandably so, because bartenders, they're not like chefs. We've never really been given that space to just plate up good produce. But at the same time, for us, it's so important to who we are. And what we try to then focus on with the team is take all of that experience of, how to make an amazing martini. You understand what texture in a drink, what temperature, what different techniques brings to making drinks. Take all of that experience and use it very, very sparingly. So if you try something and you go, this is great, it's a individual spirit, but when you make a final martini, the drink's lacking something, add a small amount of saline, add a small amount of sugar, add whatever, change the technique. that's where that's where you use those marginal gains to take something which is really interesting and authentic and meaningful and elevate it to a really amazing experience. And every time one of the new team members makes the drinks on the seasonal tasting menu, I sit there for about half an hour just saying, why? Like, why is this in here? Why is this in here? Why are we doing this? Because understandably, they want to put so much in and they want to do so much with the drinks because that's what they've been taught makes a really great cocktail and bartender. And so that's one of the hardest things. And like I said, that's where we've only recently started to hire bartenders with more experience because it was so much easier to focus on that message and that style with people who had no expectations and no preconceived notions of what mixed drinks necessarily should look or feel like.
Yeah, and it sounds like there's a mindset shift that has to happen on both sides. Just connect the dots from a few parts of our conversation. So on sort of the actual bar side, like it is bringing in people who can think probably a little bit more like a chef in terms of highlighting an ingredient without having to overcomplicate it or add too much to it. But then also from the drinkers side of things, like being able to come into a cocktail bar and order something that is unique to that place. And maybe it doesn't have the gin they expected or some other spirit that they're usually used to. So with both of those sides kind of going through this mindset shift, next time they go to their local bar or go to a restaurant and they are looking at the drinks menu, what would you recommend in terms of if people want to be a little bit more ecologically, environmentally conscious when they choose their drink selection? What would you recommend? Is it more about buying locally produced items? Is it more about understanding some of the ingredients that go into it and how they're sourced? Like from a practical standpoint for someone on the drinking side, what would you recommend?
I think that it's super important. One of the things you'll find with like a lot of those really important chefs and a lot of people in the spirits and drinks industry is you'll find that when you ask them, what is your favorite drink or what would you have in a certain place, they'll often just say, well, whatever they do there. Whatever their thing is. If you're in Cuba, they're having a daiquiri. If you're in Manhattan, they're drinking Manhattans. If you're in London, they're having a Pimm's Cup in the summer, right? And I think a lot of that goes back to the notion you spoke about before of like food and drink having a time and place. I think that if you try and stick to that idea of having things that are unique to those places, they're naturally going to include more local produce because that's what they're known for. When we were just in Peru, like the very first thing we ordered was a pisco sour, and because it also that has that authenticity and link to where you are. And from that is the easiest way to then start to understand, well, what is this place really like? Do they have their own growing cultures here? Is that why this ingredient is in this? That from in terms of ordering at the bar, that's one thing what I would always say is just have what they do in that place. Because also, I think what we've seen more and more is that the difference between like great drinks and good drinks is very, very marginal, and so much of it is down to beyond what's in the glass in front of you. It's the environment, the location, the expectation behind that. And so having somewhere that fits into all of that is much more likely to be successful than a really, really well-known martini in the wrong place. But also from the bar side of it, one of the things we always say as well is like the easiest way to make those changes is to like look at the things that you do yourself. So for example, take your best-selling drink, be like, can you replace anything in here that could be had locally? And that's the easiest way to make the biggest change with the least amount of work. It's just find those high-selling items, those high-ticket items, and just make that small change. Don't even change the recipe, just change where one of the parts of it is sourced, and you'll make a bigger impact.
And so Little Red Door has been quite progressive over the last few years in this shift to the farm to glass model. What's the next challenge for Little Red Door? What is the next thing you're hoping to accomplish to push that idea even further?
One of the parts of how we work farm to glass is 3 years ago, we decided that we were going to stop having any contracts, any agreements in place with any spirit brands for what we sell in the bar. And there's a variety of reasons for those, not least because during COVID, understandably, and we didn't take it personally, but a lot of those large companies, they put people on leave, on furlough. And so if the large company goes on furlough, your local brand ambassador from any of those large groups just disappears. But the people who didn't were the smaller brands. And then as we started to speak more and more, we realized that there were, like all huge corporations, those brands are never satisfied. The large companies are never satisfied because their values are out of line with what we were trying to create. There was no meaning or value for creating a high quality product that exists for a good reason. But for those smaller brands where branding and marketing and also authenticity of connections is a lot more valuable, we realized that what we could offer them, they would get a lot more from than those larger companies would in the first place anyway. So we decided at that point, we're going to remove all contracts. We removed every agreement we had with any of those small to medium sized craft brands. Was very informal. It was very conversational, and it was all based on reciprocity. And whether within a year, if we had someone on our menu, we would, if we found opportunities to collaborate, we would then say, "Oh, great, this has worked really well. We'll keep doing this." And if for whatever reason, and never from mal intent, we found in that year that we didn't collaborate with somebody who was on our menu because there's not a lot of crossover in what we do, then it's probably not the best fit. Once we've made that choice, it really freed us in terms of how we manage those relationships and how we focus the guest experience on creating something unique to Little Red Door. And so much of what we did became much more engaging to guests because it wasn't this is a twist on a daiquiri, and by the way, there's Bacardi in there. And we started to think more and more of these brands as though they were your big consumer crops. And there's a value to that. There's absolutely a value to having people like Bacardi and Diageo in the industry. They drive it forward. They help bring in new drinkers, and they allow for a consistent drinking experience for a lot of people. But that's not what Little Red Door is necessarily looking at developing. And so now we're moving to a model where nothing within Little Red Door exists outside of Little Red Door. So every single element of what we do is completely unique to the drinking experience within our bar in that moment. That means creating a lot more ourselves. It means creating a lot more in collaboration with people. But the idea is that we've realized we're not at all contingent on that outside intervention. And actually for us, it became a really important point of saying, this isn't something that can be commercialized or monetized. This is something that if we are nothing, we are the drinks we sell. And we have to keep that the most sacred we can, which sounds, when you talk to chefs, especially, it sounds really obvious because in restaurants, that is the base of everything. They make their name. Restaurants are good entirely on the quality of their food. And there are some places that can have awful atmospheres and even worse service, but the food could be so mind blowing and so unique that it would transcend anything else. But in the bar industry, because of the proximity to the spirits brands, a lot of that conversation has been skewed. Again, not through malintent, just because of the mechanisms of consumerism and corporations. They always have big budgets and they're always going to be able to skew or distort those narratives about what quality is. And so we're trying now focus to a little bit like we did with Farm to Glass. We know the way that we work Farm to Glass is beyond what most bars would be able to put in place, and what would actually be necessary for bigger change in the industry is something a little bit more approachable from that. The same idea is what we want to do with working with completely unique products to Little Red Door. Is we don't expect other bars to be able to necessarily replicate that model particularly well, but the idea of reestablishing that relationship that bars and brands have and the value that bars in themselves have, we think is really important.
Incredible. This is incredibly exciting, I think, from a drinker's perspective, but certainly knowing some other people in the industry, I think they'll be enlivened by this idea and this approach. So thank you so much, Alex, for taking time to chat today. And I look forward to stopping by Little Red Door the next time I'm in Paris.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure to chat.